There we go. All right, let's roll. Okay, thanks for coming. Thanks for the ENTP group for inviting me. Law and entrepreneurship, we could spend a whole semester on this. I teach an entrepreneurial finance class on this. So in the 30 minutes or less, we'll do a whirlwind tour of working with lawyers, things you need to think about with respect to starting a company and using lawyers. So David Jargiello, Case Western Reserve, 1982. I believe still to this day, class of 1982 is the only class that won the Hudson Relays all 4 years. Currently, I'm a partner at a law firm that I started some 12 years ago called VLP Law Group. We're entirely distributed, entirely virtual. And my practice is corporate finance, venture capital, has been throughout the duration of my career, and I'm also a partner in a venture capital firm that is headquartered in Santa Fe, New Mexico, although we heavily invest throughout not only the Rocky Mountain region, we also invest heavily in Silicon Valley. We did have one Case Western Reserve startup about 5 years ago that we invested in as well, just as an aside. So what I wanted to leave you with, everybody I suspect knows Mr. Spiegel, net worth in the 5 billion range, founded Snap in his fraternity house with his fraternity brothers, has one of the best quotes, and I think is the takeaway from what I wanted to leave you with today as students thinking about actively working on, involved in startups of different types. In the Economic Times Startup Awards about 5 years ago, terrific interview with Spiegel. When we were first getting started and took financing, this is when he was at Stanford, our lawyers would take us through the documents and they'd say, oh, don't worry about it. It's all standard. Sounds very similar if you've talked to lawyers. I've since learned that standard means either the person who's walking you through the documents doesn't understand them, or you could be getting taken advantage of. When someone says something is standard, just ask why, and why, and why, and why again, until you really understand intricately how the deal is structured. And better words could not have been spoken about how to use lawyers with respect to entrepreneurship, in my judgment, which is why I started with that. So in the very limited time we have, I want to walk through just sort of 4 things. Do you need a lawyer? Whose lawyer is it? Which is sort of a nuanced question, but one that is quite fundamental. Skim through the sort of big early issues one needs to think about in connection with starting a business, especially a business that's backed by professional money, and then just sort of wrap with a big picture and any questions. And I do have the chat screen up, so any questions you may have, just please type them in and let me know. So do you need a lawyer at all? So in starting a business, these are the customary options that one often hears about. Do you just not worry about it and plow ahead? There are a host of do-it-yourself solutions, LegalZoom, Rocket Lawyer, Clerky, things along those lines. Find your friendly neighbor or former college roommate or relative that's willing to work for free or almost free. Do you go out there and Google search the biggest name you can find, or do you do some combination of those things, whereby you primarily sort of do things yourself, and only when you have a, air quote question, that you actually call a lawyer? And I would suggest to you that all of these are simultaneously the exact right and the exact wrong answer. Really, the answer depends with respect to any business you're starting on a variety of factors in no particular order. Your personal level of sophistication in business matters of business, finance, and law, your network, your investors, if any, your tolerance for business and financial risk. And then lastly, just sort of the type of business you're talking about. Different types of businesses have different, vastly different legal requirements. Certainly, for example, if you are involved in a business that requires patenting something, you're going to need to onboard some patent talent fairly early on to protect your rights. As a general rule, I would say there are two things. There's a saying that floats around Silicon Valley that is, starting a company is like launching a rocket. You don't want to be too far off at the beginning, lest you be vastly off when you get to your endpoint or closer to your endpoint. Secondly, in terms of selecting somebody to represent you, gut instinct is not to be overlooked. You want somebody who certainly knows the subject matter of your business, who certainly knows how businesses are structured, and certainly if it is a venture-backed startup, somebody who fundamentally knows all aspects of venture-backed, emerging growth, rapidly growing businesses. Again, somebody that you ultimately trust. Selecting a lawyer for a business enterprise, even as in the raw nascent stage when it's just a concept in your head, that is one of the very first fundamental business decisions that you make. Who do I choose to counsel me? Who do I use to guide me? And on what terms? There are ways to overuse and underuse lawyers. I would just mention as an aside, sort of a classic what I think of as an underuse of lawyers is using a variety of do-it-yourself solutions and just rifle shotting or airdropping the lawyers in to answer questions, or finding the cheapest representation you can find. Like a lot of things in life, you tend to get what you pay for, and so it's not a place to necessarily look for the best bargain. The other end of that spectrum is overusing lawyers, which is sending your lawyers off in all sorts of crazy ideas and creating a sense of frenzy and urgency. Can get expensive real fast, and generally, I think reflects in many cases where that's the case, that there's a fundamental problem in the business as well. So if you do choose a lawyer, retain a lawyer, somebody looking like a corporate lawyer or a startup lawyer, named a corporate lawyer, startup lawyer, is going to suddenly appear on the scene. This is a nuanced point. This is a very nuanced point, but it is an important point. And that is, whose lawyer is it? So somebody will show up and there'll be a lawyer and they'll seem to know what they're talking about and what they're doing. And it is essential for persons who are engaged in starting a new business, to understand the little graphic I've depicted here in cartoon fashion. Let's say there's a company with 3 founders, A, B, and C. Who does that person represent? That startup counsel? Does he or she represent the business, the company? Does he or she represent the founders as a group? Any one particular founder individually? All of the above? Any one of those can be true. Generally speaking, there are rules of professional conduct to govern lawyers and so forth that would be implicated in those situations. But understanding who the lawyer you're working with absolute crystal clarity, it's one of those areas of the law that is really sort of a light switch on and off. Who is the lawyer's client? Is something that one should make sure you understand when you retain counsel. The big early issues. So this is the highest level sort of skim of things that one might want to think about in the earliest stage of starting a company. So I kind of break it down into these 5. And when somebody comes to me talking about a company they want to start, these sort of 5 bullet points are things that I have lifted from, my personal discussion of sort of what happens next with entrepreneurs. Intellectual property ownership and protection is sort of the first and foremost. Oftentimes what happens with startups is, there's an idea, and then there's some activity, you sort of do some things, and then there's this, hey, there's a business here, sort of this decision that's made. Then maybe there's some more stuff that's done, and stuff being defined here as sort of, if it's software business, that it's coding, for example, or if it's a maker business, you start building things, designing things, and in that process, intellectual property is being created. And the fundamental issue is, and it really is one of the threshold issues of starting a business is, if there's 2, 3, 4, 5 of you, maybe somebody else helping on the side, whose intellectual property is it? And it's a threshold question that affects all startups of any type. The need to sort of get closure on who owns the intellectual property is really one of the fundamental drivers to starting a business enterprise, which is sort of the second bullet. It's not necessarily fatal if founders go on for some period of time, without a clear understanding of who owns the IP. It certainly happens. I've certainly seen it many, many times. What it becomes is harder and harder to sort of clean up and have it come to rest properly within a finance business later, the longer that goes on. So oftentimes when businesses start, there's an imperative to start an entity very, very quickly or relatively early, such that you have an enterprise, a business enterprise, properly formed, that is actually the cetus of the intellectual property. And again, sort of the takeaways, you remember how we started here, generally speaking, how businesses startups start is, there's an idea, and then sort of things start to happen, whether it's coding or building or designing, intellectual property is being created. And as that goes on, you want to be clear that that intellectual property resides in the proper place, and it doesn't reside in any of the individuals who have been involved in the business. Once you're up and running, the issues of protection, of course, come into play. Pretty standard stuff. I guess I would say, just to simplify for purposes of this discussion, but these are things that you might have heard of or seen or used, which is non-disclosure agreements and confidential information and invention assignments agreement. In other words, things that you do for the company are confidential and secret. Inventions that you develop in the context of your employment / relationship with the company all belong to the company. That's part and parcel of sort of a basic intellectual property protection regime that, again, startup counsel who is experienced at this will implement fairly early on. I mentioned that intellectual property ownership is often a driver. There are many things that often drive one to start an entity relatively early in the process. The other one is sort of allocation of equity and understanding the relationships and control of the enterprise. And the ability to seek capital. The question becomes, again, always a threshold conversation in working with entrepreneurs is, we're going to form an entity. What kind of entity do you want to form? Really, there are a variety of options. The 3 sort of basic ones for, venture-backed startups, are C corporations or limited liability companies. If it's not venture-backed, and I guess I'll get a little bit technical here. If it's backed only by individuals, you can also use something called an S corporation. The big difference between a C corporation and a limited liability company really is for purposes of our discussion here, is the taxation. And which one do you pick? There's a narrative that exists out in the ether that limited liability companies are fast, quick, and easy, and you certainly can go on to LegalZoom or Rocket Lawyer and form one in almost literally minutes. The discussion that one has to have and sort of think through when you're forming an entity is, what is the business objective? If you're planning on taking money from investors, almost certainly the ultimate structure is going to be a corporation, and almost certainly, I don't know in Ohio, but I would say I can tell you here in California, the last time I incorporated a corporation in California was, maybe a decade ago. Generally speaking, you're going to wind up in Delaware. So if you're planning on taking professional money, generally speaking, you're going to wind up being incorporated, and you're going to be incorporated in Delaware. If it's a tax motivated business, which happens, maybe you're not thinking about taking professional money, or only a very little bit. An LLC is the correct structure. Taking money, is an important consideration. Who are you going to take money from, and on what terms? There's a range of people from whom you can take money. Individuals, angels, micro VCs, venture capitalists, private equity would be the spectrum. There's sort of a good news and bad news part of that. The good news is there's no shortage of capital out there to fund new businesses. Sort of the bad news, or maybe the practical news, is money comes, capital into a business comes with with terms and conditions that one has to understand. Go back to the Evan Spiegel quote. Make sure you understand the terms of it. Both in terms of equity you take, or money you take, and on what terms it's taken. Actually issuing equity, there's sort of 4 elements to that. There are laws regarding the issuance of equity that are not to be overlooked. The securities laws and the corporate laws, which any good startup lawyer will know, will set the contours around which one can actually issue equity. Record keeping is essential. There are whole law courses structured upon cases where founders of companies issued equity and there were no records kept of who owned how much, and guess what happens? You wind up in a fairly significant dispute. Allocation of equity is sort of a key, sort of economic and business term. The inconvenient truth is very much that it's rare for founders to be truly equal in terms of their contribution to a business enterprise. And that oftentimes is really the first really, really tough business decision that founders have to make is, I get this much, you get that much, and this person over here gets that much. Terms of equity, important to understand. I was retained recently for representing a company. Representing a founder of a company, and I found the founder was asking me detailed questions about, terms of the equity, investing, and control, and voting, and all these things. And while I was more than happy to answer those questions, what it ultimately told me was they probably had the wrong corporate counsel. So those are things that need to be thought through, and that company counsel, if you have the right counsel, should walk you through. Tax sounds like an exotic, strange concept when you're starting a business and have no revenue, but the fact of the matter is starting a business, particularly a venture-backed technology business, is often the creation of tremendous value in a short period of time from almost literally nothing. That is a prescription for the creation of tax problems And it's something that is very manageable, but it's manageable through, again, as I've said here, good counsel who knows the business. There are, in fact, elections that have to be made. There are, in fact, filings that have to be done, even in the most nascent business. And these are things to be kept in mind and thought through. At the end of the day, here's sort of the big picture takeaway, which is choosing counsel and using counsel are really early and really fundamental business decisions. Great companies make those decisions wisely. Conversely, the converse is also true. Poor use of counsel is often a sign of management dysfunction, and it raises the question among the lawyers who are representing you, among people who may be looking at giving you money, slash other, or maybe all business decisions being made poorly or less than wisely. Okay, we have a couple questions. We're past our 10-minute warning here. Contact information is on screen. I see one question here. If you're interested in entrepreneurship, do you think it's worthwhile to look into taking the patent bar yourself, or is it best to rely on external help? The patent bar is very, very difficult. I certainly wouldn't discourage anybody from taking the patent bar. If you are interested in entrepreneurship and you are interested in running a business, I guess my answer to that would be focus on running the business and being a business person. And I would retain technical help and use technical help for patenting purposes and not try to do that yourself. Next question, do you recommend consulting with a CPA in addition to your lawyer, or find a lawyer that can advise in both? Finding a lawyer that can advise in both fields would be very, very difficult. There are JD CPAs out there. I know a fair number of them. All of the lawyers I know who also are CPAs do not do any accounting at all, and they refer folks to accountants. So yes, the short answer, Sonia, to your question is, early. It's further to my early comment about tax advice matters even early. Remember this, another startup example, Instagram. Instagram is 25 months. That's 2 years and 1 month from zero. Absolute zero to a $1 billion exit. Obviously, not every outcome is like that, but the tax planning, the accounting planning, the equity allocation, had to be right early on to make that the success story it is. So the short answer to your question is yes, I would have an accountant early, and generally speaking, I would not have that be your lawyer. I would have your lawyer, I'd have your accountant as two separate people, because they really are two separate specialties. My pleasure. Any other questions? I think we're probably close to the end of our time. I think we probably have a few minutes left. Oh, what is your favorite part working in your field of law? I would say oh, that's an excellent question. Boy, that is a really good question. Thank you for that. I have to say that my favorite part of my practice, which has now spanned about 30 years in all of it in Silicon Valley, has been watching the proverbial acorns to oaks story. The mythology is true. Businesses do start from absolutely nothing, literally absolutely nothing. Two engineers and a dog in a garage, and they grow into billion-dollar companies. It happens. It can be done. It is done. I've seen it done. I've been part of it as counsel, and I think watching those things, watching the world change before your eyes, has been probably easily the favorite part of my career. All right, in session D. Thank you for attending, and thank you for having me.